Ah!
Okay. Camera speeds. Whenever you're
Camera
ready.
speed, action. Whew. Those fumes. My God, I can't even think now. Jerry, who are you? What do you do? What's your connection to the cloud guitar?
All right, I'm Jerry Ronning. I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota. I'm presently the chair of the Liberal Arts Department at the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. I'm a historian by training. The reason I'm here, and it's a really serendipitous, fantastical story, is because when I was 16 and a sophomore in high school, my high school allowed students to create a program for themselves for the May of that academic year. And at 16 years old, I and 10,000 other Minneapolitans were deeply interested in becoming guitar players in bands. And I was a big fan of the Newt Coupé Music Store, which is on 28th and Hennepin Avenue South. And I had a great many friends who lived in the neighborhood. And I wanted to learn how to make guitars. So I did the classic thing, and I walked in and I said, I will sweep your floors, stock your shelves, do whatever you need me to do if you can teach me how to make guitars. And the owners of the store, Jeff Hill and Carl Dadolf, talked to the shop manager at the time, Ross Teigen, and he agreed, yeah, I'll take him on and I'll give him some training for the school program, which lasted for May. And that was a great success, and I loved it. And apparently I was a good enough employee that they kept me on through the entire summer. And that summer, I made a Telecaster from scratch under the tutelage of Ross Teigen. Then I went back to high school, and I wanted to do it again the next summer. So the summer of 1983, I talked to the owners of the shop, and they said, yeah, you can come on back. Ross Teigen, however, had left by then. He quit just prior to my arrival, which really made me sad because I liked Ross Teigen a lot. Tommy Stinson was then the shop manager, and he said, yeah, I'll help you out. You can help me out and come and work, and I'll teach you what I know. And Tommy was just a wacky, kind of fun, crazy guy to be around. He was a brilliant finisher. He could exactly copy the kind of oxblood red of the back of a Les Paul. He was just a magician when it came to finishes. And I thought a great luthier and repair person too. So that summer, I worked again at Newt Coupé, and I made another guitar that summer, this one right here. However, I didn't make this one from scratch. All I made was the body from scratch. It's made out of hard rock maple from the same place that the hard rock maple was purchased to make the cloud guitars. The rest of the parts, if you know what you're looking at, were made by Schecter, or the pickups are EMG. That summer, as I was designing this guitar, because I wanted essentially a Strat where you could turn off and on all of the pickups. If you're a Fender aficionado, you know that the 5-way switch has some limitations, which kind of bugged me. And I was sold on the EMG pickups too. They were cool, they made no noise. All my guitars up to that point were just noisy as hell with the 60-cycle hum coming through my amp, in spite of shielding and whatnot. And so making this from scratch, we had router templates for these two pickups, but I had to make a router template for the middle pickup. I also had to figure out how to get all the electronics in the back of this guitar. And so I designed for my own guitar, and Ross Teigen, the previous shop manager, had taught me how to do this, a router template so that I could dig in here and make enough space to put all of the electronics, all of the EMG electronics in here. The plate was inspired in part, you can see some resemblance to a Les Paul backplate. Then we had a French curve, a drafting tool, and I kind of free-handed it and made it kind of match the contours of the back of this guitar. So I finished this guitar in July of 1983, which is underneath the lacquer here on the back of this headstock, which is also a Schecter neck. It yellowed in time. This is a very old guitar as well. At the end of the summer, I dropped out of high school in the interim and just went on straight to college. So at the end of the summer of 1983, I grabbed my guitar, left the shop. I spent a few weeks at college. Then I came back on the weekends to work at Newt Coupé, at which point in time I began sanding and spraying lacquer on the very first one of these, which is not this one. In between the time I went to college and came back to work on weekends, Tommy Stinson had more or less finished the body. And so at that point in time, I was doing lots and lots of sanding and lots of spraying. And you'd be surprised how difficult it is to be a good sander. It's really kind of you have to have the muscle memory, and it doesn't take 10,000 hours to learn, but a good many hours. The college I went to...
Something?
Yeah.
Wait. Just let him finish and then we'll get to it. Yeah.
The college I went to also had a very early winter break because it's Minnesota. So we all got out of school in November around Thanksgiving. So by the time I got back and worked again in the shop, the cloud guitar was gone entirely. It had been finished. So between me sanding and then going back and then coming back a few weeks later, it had made its way out into the world and was finished. And at which point, Dave Roussan was also working in the shop at that time too, with Tommy Stinson. I worked at Nuit Coupé probably through the end of 1983 into the first few weeks of 1984. Then I went back to college, and then I never really worked for Nuit Coupé again, although I was a frequent visitor and would go down to the shop and talk to folks. What I learned, right, as I got back from my summer break and went to college and then came back to work at Nuit, is that Tommy had apparently taken the template that I had made for my guitar to put EMG electronics in, and decided to use it on the cloud guitar. As you can see, it's an exact match except for size. The size difference can be explained by the plunge router we used had a different bushing on it and maybe even a different sized bit. But again, you can see it's exactly the same shape. And so I've been telling my friends this story for ages, that I sanded and made the control cavity for the Prince guitar. A lot of people believe me, but a lot of people don't, so I'm really happy to be able to show this to folks right now and show this kind of derivation of this design element. That's really all I have had to do with the cloud guitar, although I have since become a historian and I've taken tons of oral histories, and I'm doing an oral history of the Nuit Coupé guitar store, which is how John Woodland learned my name and dragged me into this kind of exploration of the history of the cloud guitar. It's very serendipitous, but it's been fun. Some things that I did wrong, because again, I was 17 years old when I made this. Okay.
Let's hold. I want to ask you.
Oh, go for it, yeah.
John, what was your point that you were going to make?
Or Bay.
Oh, okay, Barry.
The success, or how should I put this? A paint job's only going to look as good as the prep work.
Mm-hmm.
So prep work is about 95% of a good-looking paint job.
Mm-hmm.
So if you want to ask him about that, or
Okay.
this is something that should be noted, that prep work is essential.
And Jerry, you talked about sanding the wood and then wet sanding.
Yeah,
What the difference is,
That's good.
like,
Thanks.
Okay.
if we're still
We'll take care of
recording,
those two
okay.
things at the same time. Then.
Okay.
We'll talk about prep work
Okay.
and we'll go into sanding.
Okay.
Yeah.
So-
just hold on
Okay.
1 second. Are we still good?
Yeah, we're
We're
speaking.
still good. Jerry, tell us about the prep work.
Okay, so as I said, I did a lot of sanding. And actually, I did a lot of sanding the first summer I worked there, and I did a lot of sanding the second summer I worked there. It's not a pleasant task, but it's a kind of a difficult task, and I got quite good at it. And so on the cloud guitar, the first one, I sanded bare wood. So I saw the maple, and it's really hard. Sanding maple is like trying to sand metal. It's tough stuff. But it is a kind of a difficult thing to do it right. You begin, especially when you put a finish on it, you can see imperfections, or getting a curve right is harder than you think, or seeing the flat spots around curves. So I sanded the wood on the first cloud, and I also did wet sanding when the finish was applied. Now also Tommy allowed me to shoot some coats of lacquer. Obviously not the initial initial color coats, because that's pretty essential, but I could put clear on. And that summer that I worked solely with Tommy, since Ross left in either April or May, I actually did a lot of spraying, especially of Jesse Johnson's guitars, in the basement of Nuit Coupé and others, because Tommy kind of offloaded some stuff that he could trust me to do all right. Although I have a sneaking suspicion, as I was telling someone earlier, you can tell I sprayed a guitar because there are at least 2 times as many coats as need to be on there, and they're thicker as well. It was just a rookie mistake. So that was the kind of work I did on this. I'm not the maker, nor did I necessarily design the cloud guitar, but I did this kind of support work. And then this little detail here was something that I created. But again, like in the shop, as I kind of used a Les Paul backplate as an inspiration. That was kind of the DIY spirit in the basement, is look around at what you have, make it work. I made the template, and then because I presumed it was kind of a work for hire thing, I just tossed it on the wall. And there it was, if anyone wanted to use it. And luckily for me, it was used later on what became a very famous instrument.
How important is the prep work to the finishing process?
I think it's essential. Luthiers are going to know more about this than I, but I've seen guitars finished that have poor prep work, and you can tell, right? And again, getting this to look smooth, it's a hell of a lot harder than you think it is, right? And there's a lot that you don't see, that's kind of hidden by the final product. Many, many hours though, especially because it was maple, hard rock maple of sanding. It takes a lot of elbow grease and sweat equity, but to do it right, I think, it's a good thing I had done it the summer before and I'd been working on my own instruments. This I carved out of hard rock maple, and it was just devilishly hard to get this belly cut in here using rasps and whatever kinds of tools I could use, and the cut on the front.
Why is there tape on the back of the guitar?
The tape is on the back of my guitar because there is a significant design flaw, which ironically is reproduced in several of the clouds insofar as, you're kind of routing two different holes when you do a cover for a control cavity. You're doing the deeper hole, which all the electronics go into, and then you're doing a slightly shallower hole so that the scratch plate fits flush, right? What I did that's incorrect, that is oddly reproduced in some of the other clouds, is I made this little shelf of wood here that the scratch plate sits upon really narrow, not wide enough for a screw to get good purchase, and it's stripped almost immediately because, again, you're taking the back plate on and off because it's an EMG pickup. They require batteries to send a signal out. And so after just a few times of taking this off, the screws stripped the wood it was in. And so ultimately I ended up just taping it on because it just didn't work. And that's the kind of design flaw, again, that if I made a number 2 of this or a number 3 of this, I may have figured that out, right? And put something in there to compensate for the lack of space for screws to get a purchase into the wood. Even if it's maple, eventually you're gonna strip that out. And so that's why this is taped on. It's been on there ever since. There's of course dangers in taping it on. Sometimes the battery will fall out and the weight of the battery will rip a wire out of an input jack or anything. But again, that was one of the compromises. And in retrospect, had I been a better luthier, I probably would have figured that out or thought about it in advance. But you have to make mistakes to get things right.
Speaking of mistakes, how old were you when you made these plates?
I was 16 when I started at Newton in the summer of '82. I was 17 in 1983 when I made these plates. I have to apologize for not being a super Prince fan. He's one of many people in Minneapolis I bought records from, so I think it was kind of lost on me what I was doing at the time and for whom, and that may have been true for everyone in the shop, because who knew, right, that his star was going to shoot so far and so brightly and so high. But yeah, I was a very, very young person at the time. For my efforts the following year, the owner of the store, Jeff Hill, I was in there in January or February, whenever, this happened. He said, "Yeah, Jerry, you worked on the guitar." And I said, "Yeah, I did." And he gave me 2 tickets to the Minneapolis opening at the Skyway Theater. I asked my girlfriend at the time if she'd go with me. Of course, we both went down to the opening of the movie in the Skyway Theater. When Prince died, she, out of the blue, sent me a text message and just asked, "Did we really do that? Or was that a dream?" And I said, "Nope, we were really there." We went to the opening, and it all comes down to that magic little shape I put in the back of my own guitar, and a lot of sanding on Cloud 1.
Could you really quickly for me restate that you got those tickets into what movie?
Oh, I'm sorry, Purple Rain, the Minneapolis premiere of Purple Rain. It was at the Skyway Theater in downtown Minneapolis, and it was an event. It was super cool as well.
That's great. Describe for me quickly the process of creating a control plate.
Well, I mean, to create this control plate, and again, you're talking about 41 years ago, you figure out how much space you need for the electronics. Now, I wanted mini switches here, which were beginning to be kind of a thing. If you look at superstrats from the era, it's a fad to have mini switches in there. And then you have potentiometers, the control pots, the volume and the tone. And so you kind of, and this has the input jacks on the side, like a Telecaster, whereas the Cloud, it goes straight into the front, more like an SG. So that this, I don't need as much space in here for stuff as we need for the Cloud guitar. But you kind of draw out what you want it to look like from the front, or at least I did. Where do I want the pots to be and where do I want the switches to be? And that's kind of an aesthetic decision, and you can make all sorts of them. So as you can see, this is kind of reminiscent of a typical Fender Stratocaster layout in terms of some of the angles and things. This is a little bit different. This 5-way switch would have been somewhere else. And then in terms of the back, I was thinking about the shape. I wanted a shape that complemented the curve of the lower bout of the Strat, that looked, to my eyes, aesthetically pleasing. You don't want this to dominate the back. I wanted to take as much wood, as little wood out as possible. You'll see some backplates that just gouge out tons of wood to make space, and that's great because you have tons of room to work with, but to my eyes, it didn't look very cool. As you can see, I used string trees here to kind of back mount the pickups. And again, my thought was I didn't want to gouge out massive amounts of wood and have big pick guards on it. Just from a design perspective and from an aesthetic perspective, this seemed nice to me. And I started again with kind of the curve of a half of a Les Paul. Then I kind of freehanded it. Then I got we had some graphic design tools in the basement for drawing things out, and this completed the curve and made it kind of match the curve of the Stratocaster.
Let's zero in a little bit on the actual making the plate, if you don't mind, just like.
And so that's where the idea of that came from. It's not genius, right? It's just kind of, you're in the shop and you're doing what looks good to you, and I just thought it was going to be a one-off, but so many of the things I did in the shop, I really felt as a 17-year-old that I wanted to be part of the shop. So of course I'm going to make a template, toss it on the wall, and anyone else who works there, I hoped it would show up on another guitar someday.
How'd you make the template?
The template is simply a drawing, right? And then it's one side sticky, right? And you put it over pickguard material. And I initially used a bandsaw to cut around that shape. And then I kind of sanded, and then used that, and this wasn't the original, this was the plate, and then used that plate to create the jig for the plunge router. And when you do that, you have to compensate for the fact that it's, you're going to want to have it slightly smaller than the plate itself. Once you've got the deep hole in there, you can take a router bit that has like a little ball bearing on the end, but cutting above it, and run that across, and it'll be slightly wider than this, and then you can cut the material out at the top of the plate. There are different sizes, obviously, that you can use, and different size bushings and things, and I clearly did not pick a big enough cut. It probably would have been better if it was, this looks to me to be about maybe a quarter, 3/8 of an inch probably would have been better. Get bigger than that, and it seems ugly to me, and bigger. And I think, the Cloud guitar is significantly smaller than this, and that may be why they used a smaller or a bigger bushing and a smaller bit in terms of putting it in the back here. In retrospect, they might have wanted to keep it big to make more space in there because they're jamming more stuff in there, but it is, in fact, the identical shape.
Why is the Cloud plate slightly smaller?
Why is the Cloud plate slightly smaller? Again, I didn't write on the template the size bushing I used or the size bit I used. I just tossed the template up. So the next luthier who grabs the template with no guidance is going to be making that decision all on their own, right? What kind of bushing do I want to put in there? What kind of bit do I want to use? I was not around when Tommy grabbed this and decided to route the back of the Cloud guitar. All I knew was that, hey, you used my template, and there it is. It's also a slightly smaller guitar. I don't think aesthetically, to me, it really would have made much of a difference. So I think it was just, one of those serendipitous kinds of things that you while you're making it, you make a choice. And
So the size discrepancy, would that have been an equipment issue? Would that have been a different router bit?
No, it would, probably just the bushing. And the bushing is what you put on there's a flat surface on a plunge router that goes up and down. There's a large circle and there's the bit, right? A bushing is simply a piece of metal that has different size circular holes that the bit's gonna fit through. That you screw into the base of the router. And we had multiple sizes at the shop, depending on what kind of difference you wanted between the outer circumference and the inner circumference of whatever hole you're making in the guitar. And that can be true for if you wanted to do, pickup routes, input routes, all these things. You can use the same template, but then you put different bushings on so that you can make that ridge that the plate's going to rest upon when you screw it into the guitar.
Lastly, how do you feel about your role in all of this?
It's just entirely accidental, right? When John got a hold of me, it just, how weird, right? To be dragged into this thing for something that I did entirely for myself. Again, I want to take no credit for the design of the cloud guitar. This is what I made it for. And I happened to be able to work on a cloud guitar, which is also super cool. I worked on lots of kind of cool instruments on those 2 summers. So, I mean, if the question is how do I feel about my role, really lucky, right? It's just one of those things that I accidentally backed into, that it got me to a premiere of a movie. I have great memories of it. It was super fun working in the guitar store. And it kind of just makes that memory all the more vivid, if I can connect it to these kinds of things.
That's all I've got. John, anything?
Yeah, I guess, Mike, I would ask Gerald about the finish on the Strats and what the reason that is because Tommy helped him paint it white, which was the same finish as the cloud guitar.
Oh, yeah.
So we can
So that's nitrocellulose. It's not a.
Yeah, it's nitro, yeah.
So we can actually take the neck off later and detail where that is. I can show you guys. The other question is, that Jerry can probably just expand on instead of asking is that Tommy's, what was Tommy's cure time, drying time for nitrocellulose lacquer?
Mm-hmm. I can just go ahead and answer the question if it's running. Okay, so the finish, this guitar did not start out gray, and this is in fact 1956 Cadillac interior gray, and that's the color, and I remember that. It might be 57, but it's Cadillac interior. It started out white, the same exact color that was eventually the Cloud Guitar 1 was painted. And so Tommy showed me how to mix the paint, and I shot most of the paint. My problem with the paint was, Tommy, the clear coat would be a slightly milky, not a clear coat that he put over the white, which would give it a slight coloration. And it's nitrocellulose lacquer, not acrylic lacquer. The lifespan of nitrocellulose lacquer is much less stable than acrylic lacquer. So within a very short time, and also because I was not a great sprayer and the coats were not necessarily even. Now, if Tommy had done this entirely himself, it would have aged perfectly, right? All the colors would have matched. But I started getting blotches of yellow where I put more lacquer on or less lacquer on. And so pretty shortly after I made it, I just didn't like it. It was looking a little too blotchy and yellowy. And also as a punk rocker at the time, I had been a Jimi Hendrix fan, thus white, but my taste changed over time, and so gray seemed to be a more ideal color. So I took all that off, and then Tommy just painted it this gray color. And you can see it's chipping, it's checked a hell of a lot more than this one. It's acting a lot like a different kind of lacquer. And so that's why it's gray. But if you scraped some of the paint off, or you went into the control cavity, you'd see, right, some of the white there. And so that's the story of the color of the guitar, and why it might be gray. But again, if you take it apart, you'll see little bits of white here and there. I imagine if you did the chemical analysis, you'd find out that it's more or less the same kind of nitrocellulose lacquer that was sprayed on all of the new coupe guitars until Mark Sampson came and switched us over to acrylic, which to be honest is a hell of a lot safer and a lot easier to use. The cure time is also kind of an interesting problem with Newt Coupe guitars, especially in the summer, right? June, July, August, September. If you had walked into the basement shop, it would have been, it did not look like an uber professional shop, right? The spray booth essentially had a screen door on it with one fireproof fan out of the back. When we sprayed, we held our breath, and because the system for cleaning out the air was really primitive. And there was a closet that we had in the summer where we would hang guitars with a dehumidifier. At least 2 weeks, right? And you could spray, you could get it wet sanded out to 1600, it'd be beautifully smooth, you'd put your final coats on, and after 2 weeks in this humidified room, you'd come back and it would almost look like wood again because it would have shrunk, right? Even if you fill the grain, and it's tough, you don't really fill the grain on hard rock maple because it's not gonna take grain filler. So after 2 weeks, right, if this was curing in this room, I would again have to wet sand it up to 1600 because some people would call it orange peel, but it looks like grain. But you can understand why people call it orange peel. It gets dimpled, right? And so nitrocellulose lacquer is pretty volatile and it's going to shrink a lot. In the winter, it wasn't as big of a problem because in Minnesota, we have very, very low humidity in the winter. But even then, you're talking about a 2 week time between your last coats and then the final wet sanding at minimum. Or it's going to look pretty trashy pretty quickly after that. For instance, if I had wet sanded this 1 week after and then buffed it out, it would have continued to shrink, and then then it would look like very shiny orange peel. And so it's at least a 2 week dry time in the summer months in Minnesota. And so that's another feature of nitrocellulose lacquer.
All right. I think that's it. Let's get Barry and Jerry and more action. Doesn't that feel official? Barry, if I could get you to say who you are, what your connection to the cloud guitar is, and a little bit about working at Newt Coupe. That would be great.
Sure. My name is Barry Haugen. I've been doing guitar work since 1982, 1983. There was a guitar repair school or a stringed instrument repair school in Red Wing, and I attended that school for about a year. Half the curriculum was guitars and stringed instruments. The other half of the curriculum were violins. And so after a year of that school, there was a job opportunity in Atlanta, Georgia, in a place called Atlanta Guitar Works. And I worked there for about a half a year before the owners decided they were going to have an argument about who knows what. The phone got shut off, and back in those days there were no cell phones, so all the work dried up. So I packed up all my shit and I moved back to Minnesota, and shortly thereafter I found a gig at a small music store in Stillwater called Water Music. And probably in May or June of that year, 1984, the owner of the guitar store at that point asked me if I could go to Chicago to go to the NAMM show. And I said, yeah, sure. And while I was at the airport going to Chicago, I met Dave Roussan, who was one of the repairmen at Newt Coupe. And he said, well, you ought to apply to Newt Coupe. He said, you'd be a really great fit. And well, I said, after I got out of school, I did apply there. And he said, apply again. So this was in about June or so of 1984. Fast forward to November of 1984, I got a call from Newt Coupe. And they said, can you help us get Prince and Sheila E. ready to go on the Purple Rain tour? Well, they had actually been on tour up to that point in November, and they were going to be playing some gigs in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And one of the first repairs I remember doing was making a mirrored pickguard for the guitar player for Sheila E. And so I worked at Newt Coupe for about a half a year or so. And in that time, this was one of actually 5 guitars that were built for Prince, 4 that he owned and played on stage. The fifth one was built for a contest that Prince's label, Warner Brothers, wanted to do for a giveaway. So by the time I got to Newt Capet in the November of 1984, there was two other crafts people at Newt Capet, Dave Roussan and Mark Sampson. Mark Sampson was a painter up to that point, and he transitioned me from painting nitrocellulose, which I painted back when I was going to trade school, to acrylic lacquer. So up until this guy was painted yellow, the first coat that Mark Sampson painted was white, and it was acrylic lacquer. Now acrylic lacquer and nitrocellulose are two different animals. So Mark taught me how to paint lacquer, the acrylic lacquer, and shortly after that, when I would go to my paint supply store to buy supplies, the guys behind the counter said, "Well, why are you using lacquer? That's old-fashioned." He says, "You need to start using acrylic urethane, which is like an epoxy. You mix part A to part B to a reducer, you stir that up, you pour it in your cup can, and you spray it. You have 2 hours to spray it before it hardens up on you." So it's a different chemical reaction to harden the paint. So on this particular guitar, the yellow paint, I had met another guy through the owner of Newt Capet Music. His name was Carl Diedolf. He had a partner, and they had a company called World Ferrari. Now World Ferrari, they bought and sold Ferraris, they had a repair shop, they had a paint shop. And their head painter came from House of Color. This is a John Kosmosky paint, and anybody that knows anything about custom cars, paint jobs and or choppers, motorcycles, Harleys, you name it, uses House of Color paint. It's the top of the top. So he taught me how to, this guy, I'm sorry if I can't remember his last name, his first name was Kirby. Kirby got me in touch with John Kosmosky. I had gotten a color swatch in from Prince, or one of his guitar techs, saying, "We need this guitar painted, and this is the color we want." So I went to Kirby, I said, "I need some really great paint." He hooked me up with House of Color. I did some seminars with John Kosmosky, and they taught me a whole lot of techniques to use this stuff. And so when you paint a guitar, I'm going to stand up a second here.
Let's hold a second. I have a question for our camera operator. When he's sitting on the table, the guitar is jiggling around a lot.
Okay, I'll try to stand up maybe.
Yeah, maybe we keep him standing.
Sure.
If that's okay.
Yeah.
Did that show up a lot on camera?
No, this is we're in a wide shot.
Okay, good. All right, Barry, let's go back just a little bit. Let's get to the paint in a minute, but let's go back a little bit. How long were you at Newt Capet?
I started in 1984, officially, and I left in 1992.
Okay. And did you do all the repairs on Prince's guitars?
Up until that point, when Dave Roussan left Newt Capet, he had been primarily doing most of the cloud repair work and construction of the guitars. There are other people before Dave, but after Dave left in 1985, after the fifth guitar was built for Warner Brothers, I took over doing all the repair work and all the paint work.
Now, how often were you repainting these guitars?
More than I wanted to. It seemed like every other month a guitar tech from Paisley Park was coming with a broken guitar or the request to, well, this white guitar needs to be painted blue now, or needs to be painted peach or black, whatever. I was, like I said, there are 4 original guitars plus number 5. They all started out as white, but through the course of Prince's recording career, they got changed. Now, a lot of people mistakenly think when Prince debuted a black guitar, for example, or the Blue Angel, for example, they thought it was a new guitar. They're all repainted. So the 4 original guitars always were 4, just different, paint jobs.
How many colors did this guitar have?
I believe this particular one is 3. It started out as white, it went to black. Can I have my coach?
Yeah.
This is why we need everybody to have a microphone.
Yeah, that's great.
So it's white, peach, yellow.
Okay, white, peach, yellow. And after the first time it was done, I had to strip the white paint off. I put automotive primer on it. One thing I didn't mention is that painting a guitar is practically like painting a car. Same procedures. So the primer gray, the peach, a base coat would go on, then a clear coat on top of that. After the clear coat dried to a point where I could lightly sand it, then I could put on these electro set overlays. And then after that was done, I could put on another coat of clear. Once the clear got dry, I can put on frets, new frets, and the whole process would hopefully last less than a week, which is at that time pretty accelerated.
Could you define for me what the electro set is?
Electro set is a type or a brand of these transfers that came on a sheet of paper, and you cut a section out, and you take like an end of
Hold on a
a.
second. Police.
Oh,
Sorry.
I'm innocent. So you'd use like the end of a ballpoint pen or something like that. Not the pen itself, but something hard and smooth, and I would just rub it off. It would transfer from that sheet of paper onto the guitar.
Were these part of the electro set, or were these custom made for?
They're custom made. I went into a stationery store where this type of thing was being made at the time, and I said, this symbol, I need you to make me a sheet. And whenever I would run out, they'd make me a new set.
It's pretty common back in the analog era of graphic design, when you're doing posters or layouts or things, you use these dry transfer things.
Okay.
And so,
Hey, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but if I could ask a question, and Barry, you can tell me answer.
Woody, could you come over here and ask it?
Yeah.
So that he's looking toward the camera.
I guess the question is, like, this guitar went from white to peach to yellow, and you said you had stripped the white. Why is it that you stripped the white? And there's obviously layers, we know that from the paint chips. On most of the area we don't see white underneath, so I'm just wondering, like, was it because of the type of finish that was used? And
Yeah, that's a good question. There's a compatibility issue with different types of paints. In other words, the acrylic urethane going over an acrylic lacquer wasn't necessarily a good adhesion. So it would have to be, the original paint would have to be stripped off, reprimered, and repainted for best adhesion.
Could you describe for me the process of stripping the guitar? Did you use sandpaper? Did you use chemicals?
Well, I started out with like a methylene chloride stripper, an epoxy stripper, pretty nasty shit. Gloves. You should wear a mask, but I bet you I didn't wear a mask all that often.
We'll cut that.
And, you just paste it on and it would bubble off. Take a scraper, and you had layers and layers of newspaper. It would take that bubbled paint, put it on a sheet of newspaper, crumple it up, throw it away, start with a new one. And then finally you would get to sandpaper. I think there was a picture of me at one point sanding a cloud guitar. Maybe you could insert that at that point.
Yeah.
And the sand, when you say you're sanding it, what grit are you starting with?
Probably 120, nothing too aggressive. 120 grit is considered like a light to, I don't know, medium. I'd go from 120 to maybe 180 and complete it with 220. And at that point, it's ready for primer. Now, after the primer goes on, that gets sanded back. And once that got sanded back to like 400 grit, then I can spray paint.
I have two more questions, if I could.
What are they on my list already?
Well, why, so why are we seeing layers in the paint chip? What versus, why didn't you strip it? You only stripped the white, why didn't you strip?
Because once I strip the white and use, this would either apply to the peach guitar or the yellow guitar. If Prince had the guitar brought in with road rash on it, I don't have necessarily the time to repaint the whole thing. I can touch up the little chips here and there and maybe frost in some clear on top of that, buff that back, and I'm good to go.
But do you think that it was, and I forgot what, if you said it was acrylic,
Urethane.
but what was the white finish?
That was acrylic lacquer.
So would acrylic urethane bond? Like, so you were stripping acrylic lacquer because it wouldn't bond, right?
Correct.
And so the reason there's layers, like we're seeing primer peach, primer yellow, is because that's the same type of paint.
It's the same type of paint.
Okay.
So there,
Hold. Can we ask that question in a way that he says it?
Yeah,
All
and
layers.
my only other question, and you can ask these, is why do we only see white paint in the bushings, the metal bushings? The reason is because you plug those when you paint
Okay.
it.
So the last question you asked, John, was why do we see the layers? Correct? Was that the last question?
Oh, I just thought it would be good to explain why the white was stripped in the bonding process. Like, yeah, I mean, I think he said it, but like.
So why was the white stripped, and what was the process? What was the bonding?
the process or the reason why I'd had to strip the white is because I wanted to make sure 100% that the new paint, be it peach, that was a subsequent color after the white. I wanted to make sure that that peach was going to stick on that guitar. And that's why I stripped off the white paint. And that's why the primer went on, because like I said, with car paint on bare metal, on a car or the motorcycle tank, you strip it to clean metal, you put on your gray primer, which is compatible with the urethane. Everything has to be compatible within a family of paint.
Is that why we see the layers of paint built up?
Yeah, because after the peach guitar, if it was in fairly good shape, if there wasn't any major gashes or dents, I can use that as a base coat or a base layer. At that point, I would scuff sand the whole guitar with 400. I would repair any dings with Bondo or filler of some sort, sand that smooth, possibly spot repair with a little layer of gray primer. Then I can put on my next color, which would have been the yellow, and then the clear coat. Is that a little more
That's
specific?
Great. Woody also mentioned touch-ups. Are there any touch-ups on this guitar?
Plenty, several.
Can you point some out to us?
Well, we don't have a black light in here, do we? But there's, can we get a close-up on any of
Are
this?
we going to be able to crop later,
I would,
after the fact?
yeah, after he's talking, then I can punch in, I think.
Okay,
Yeah.
we'll punch in after you.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's some flaws right about here and here. I think we had some issues across the back edge and the top edge where I think I had to fog in some new clear lacquer. We do have cracks on the back of the headstock by the neck, by the nut. I'm not sure if there's some finish cracking in the fretboard, and other than that, this guitar is very clean. As far as that,
We've got touch-ups on the very tip of the headstock on the scroll.
yeah, well, right back here, there's the back tip of the guitar is broken off. These guitars had a lot of damage over the years. It'd be really easy for something like that to happen.
You'd give me a heart attack.
I got it.
What else? What else?
The only place I see white is in the bridge post screws that are in.
If we take either the back plate off or the pickup plate back here, there was probably some paint, white paint inside. And that's something I'm not going to do. It's just a waste of time.
But would there be a reason that there would be white paint in the metal bushings inside the body versus other places?
Are you talking about the bridge?
Yeah.
Well, I guess one thing I didn't specify is that all the parts have to be off the guitar, right? So the two pots here, the switch, the jack, the bridge, these studs, these big metal bolts that anchor into the body, anchor into a threaded, what's the term, John? A bushing? Well, you could probably see little specks of white that were originally sprayed.
Because you would plug those, right? Because you wouldn't take the bushings out when you repaint.
No, I'd leave the bushings in and possibly make a dowel or a piece of masking tape and putting that down in the hole.
That makes sense, yeah. Cool.
All right, let's.
You want me to get the close-ups of it? Go ahead.
Oh yeah, we need to get the close-ups of you pointing to some of the places. Where
Okay.
Stand by.
So we're definitely gonna hit right here because we can definitely see them on camera.
Yeah.
And probably tip of the headstock as well.
One like around here somewhere.
Oh yeah, there's this one.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
Want me to walk up to you?
Nope, you can stay right there. And if he wants, if it helps, you can go over the audio again, just for the motion of things.
Yeah, we talked. You started off talking about
This area.
right there, which I think is important since we can actually see it with the naked eye. So yeah, let's just start with that.
So there.
Do you have it, or do you need him to point it up for longer?
Let's see. Let's see this. Oh, I'll cut real quick and then I'm gonna expose properly.
Did I cast a shadow on the cloud? It's a kind of hubris I just don't want to be accused of.
And whatever.
Yeah, set.
Good. Were the cloud guitars made by one person, or was it a community effort?
I mean, I have an opinion about this, obviously. The designer of what he called the F bass, Jeff Levin, right, is responsible in many ways for the initial shape. The shop, I think Nut Coupe has a lot to do with it. And there are lots of individuals that created the systems that went into creating guitars at Nut Coupe. Dudley Gimple was the person who kind of pioneered the kind of tools and jigs and taught everyone how to do that. Ross Teigen kind of further refined those processes, and all the work they did for Prince before that got them into this mode where they would try crazy things and you know, do what Prince asked. Obviously, I accidentally designed the control cavity on the back. People made individual design decisions, groups of individuals, about, you know, every element of the guitar. I think that really you're looking at, you know, this guitar emerging, not, you know, it's not that there are no authors of the guitar, but it's really, you know, a lot of people that had something to say about what it ultimately looked like. And I haven't even begun to talk about O'Hagan, right? From which the necks, the bodies, decisions about hardware. This is exactly the kind of hardware that was on an O'Hagan guitar. So a lot of decisions weren't even made. They were kind of pre-made for the shop. And And it's a small shop. Economy is a big issue, and Barry can speak to this even better than I can. You used what was on hand, right? Barry and Ross were the only two people trained at Red Wing. Everyone else was kind of self-taught or taught by experience. So this instrument, I mean, when people ask me, I say, well, Newt Coupé made this guitar, right? If you want to look for one author, look at this shop and the shop experience. Although lots of people had a lot to do with these things, right? We know who built them, we know their names, and not to take credit away from the people that made them, it's really a lot of people's work and imaginations, either purposefully or accidentally, went into what this ultimately became, right, the first cloud guitar. And I don't want to leave Prince out either, right? He's the person that gravitated toward this kind of wacky design. It's his kind of genre-defying imagination that finds a place for this and makes it the star of a movie. So, you know, that's my answer to that question, is it's a lot of people.
Well, as I had said before, I was the last guy hired out of the 4 original guys that worked on these guitars. It was no mistake that Tommy Stinson was the first one on board. That's probably contrary to urban mythology, but that's the truth. And after he got started and worked for a couple of years, Dave Roussan came back into the picture, then Mark Sampson, then me. So there's 4 core guys that worked on these guitars from whenever it started to when I left in 1991.
Do we want to talk about Dave Roussan's involvement at all?
He did a lot of repair work. He did a lot of the building on the cloud guitars.
I think it's important to give credit to Dave for
Yeah.
Absolutely.
and it's only
How much time do we have
they
left?
made this particular guitar.
14 minutes.
Okay.
Let's
Can-
talk a little bit about Dave Roussan.
All right, so when I got there in 94,
84.
84, I'm sorry, thank you.
Let's start over.
When I got there in probably November 84, Dave and Mark were just swamped with getting these guitars ready for Purple Rain. And I was pretty much hired to work on all the other repairs because it was just not Prince coming into that repair store. It was many other musicians, some not so famous, some famous. But my task was getting other repair work done. Dave and Mark were concentrating on the clouds. When Mark left in probably early 1985, I was the paint guy. So not only was I doing repairs, I was doing all the paint work, leaving Dave with the construction responsibilities on the O'Hagan guitars, to making the conversion from O'Hagan to a cloud.
Yeah, I think without question, Dave Roussan plays a significant role in the history of the clouds. Only a fool would argue otherwise, I think. It's, you know, and as Barry says, I was gone. I mean, I worked with Dave Roussan maybe for a few weeks in November of 1983. But, you know, undoubtedly he played a key role, as did everyone else I think who was involved. Barry did lots of repairing and fabricating. As we all know, these things came back to the shop, you know, after having experienced multiple car wrecks on these tours, and so you're doing reconstructive surgery every time they come back in. So that, which is another reason why they're all kind of different, right? Because you're looking at objects like a NASCAR, right, that's been repaired and put back on the track again and again and again, and every time that happens, someone like Barry or someone like Dave is going to have to figure out how to repair. And in my opinion, I think repairing is equally, if not more challenging as making, right? Because you're trying to reproduce something that existed rather than saying, I made it, here it is. And it's not easy work, and Dave did a lot of that as well.
Woody, anything else?
I can talk about a little bit to what Jerry just said.
Yeah.
There's a couple examples when the headstock was completely sheared off. And the first time it happened, I was clueless how to repair that. I ended up having to contact my instructor from Red Wing, David Patterson, his level of expertise is I'm a mere mortal. He is way up here. And I went down to his shop in Northfield, and he helped me figure out how to graft on a new neck. And that was a process. So the first time it happened, I credit Dave Patterson quite a bit. The second time it happened, it was post 1989, and I repaired the second time. After watching Dave set up the repair, I knew I was confident that I could do it myself, but a broken headstock was so common on these guitars. Sometimes they would break right here, and there'd be some fragments of wood holding it together, but those other 2 times it was totally sheared off.
But not this one, right?
Not this one. This one actually hasn't been played a whole lot. And we think because of this horn being in the way of the fret position markers was one reason. The other reason is that the size and shape of the neck is really like an O'Hagan guitar. Prince had smaller hands, so he liked a smaller neck profile. I think Dave Roussan shaved down number 2 cloud to about 1.5 inches. This at the nut is about 1 5/8.
Yeah, it's 1.56. I
Okay.
measured it. Cool. Anything else we want to touch on? How much time do we have?
9 minutes.
9 minutes.
I can talk for 9 minutes. So.
I know.
You go ahead.
Anything else, Woody? I feel like we got
I
it.
think, I think a lot of the other stuff that we're all thinking of would sound good in a group, like, so. I mean, I think, Jerry, it's fine to say Tommy was with you during that time. Like, if, whether if you want to or not, but it's just like, who was with you at that time when you sanded the cloud?
Oh yeah, I mean it was Tommy.
And-
So
and-
yeah.
And how do you remember those dates? Because you've told me all this
Mhm.
again, so.
Well, the dates I remember because I remember my school calendars, so I can pin them down. I can go back if I wanted to on the web and find out exactly when school started in the fall of '83. So and we all know when Thanksgiving occurred, and so I'm pretty sure about the dates. And Tommy was the person I worked with exclusively that summer. When I got back and would work weekends occasionally, it was all Tommy until I got back from school with the really long 6-week winter break that my college had. And then Dave was there. But by then, the cloud guitar had flown the coop, and we were doing other things. And so I'm relatively certain about these dates, and they can be confirmed through other sources, but that's my memory. And it was really kind of it was the Tommy Stinson show in the summer for sure, and it was the Tommy Stinson show for much of the fall until Dave arrived from England. I also kind of know these dates too because Dave turned me on to the shop in England that he worked at. And the following year, I just left school entirely and went to Europe and tried to get a job at Chandler Guitars because Dave said they liked American luthiers better than European luthiers. And so that sent me on this Pyrrhic quest to Europe, and I totally frittered away my time and money and never got that job. But also that occurred, that was definitely the winter of '85, and that would have been the following year. And Dave was still there at Newt Coupé then.
I got something else.
What's that?
When I got there in 1984, it was common knowledge that Tommy Stinson built the first guitar and that he had started number 2. Dave Roussan never told me, ever, that he built the first one.
How much time do we have left?
7 minutes.
7 minutes.
I got another comment too,
Go for it.
and I was told explicitly not to talk about the O'Hagan connection with the cloud guitars. The reason being that would take away the mystique of a custom guitar.
That was an issue that, I mean, I've interviewed Dave Roussan since too, but Prince had total creative control. So for the longest time, this was a Prince design, right? Even though we all knew the sardonyx bass was in the shop and he didn't design it because he did want absolute creative control. And I think there are a lot of reasons for that. But even Dave, when I interviewed him when Prince was still alive in 2011, was really reticent about talking about the cloud guitar on record because there was a non-disclosure agreement apparently signed about this and other issues. And we all know how vigilant Prince was about his image and how he was really ready to send people out to make sure that the image that was being projected
He was
one that
litigious.
wanted.
He
was
liked
very
suing
litigious.
people.
So I think that contributes to the mystery behind it, right? And when you say, this is common knowledge now that there were O'Hagans, but I want to say back in 2005, 6, 7, if I said, yeah, it was an O'Hagan, if I'm talking to the right person, that'd be kind of this slack-jawed, huh? You know, it's, but now it's relatively common knowledge. But at the time, this was allegedly had sprung forth from Prince's mind, and it was his design. And that's, you know, in some ways you're going to have to give him credit too for bringing the design forward. It's his image, he crafted it, it's his stage show. So I you know, in a way, he's kind of an auteur of his image. I think there is, you know, credit to be given there too. That in practice, it kind of is Prince's guitar in a lot of ways.
I think we're good. We did it.
That's great.
We did it.
Okay.
Everybody.
Did we screw your agenda up,
Fantastic.
John?
So this is a test. 1, 2, 3.
Oh, you weren't. Start there.
And then rotate
Hold
to the
for
right.
a moment. And rotate slowly. Hold. That's perfect. That's exactly what we need.
Okay.
All right. Real quick, Barry. Why'd you bring some paint with you?
Why?
Yeah.
Because I think we wanted to authenticate that that paint is on that guitar.
Great.
Is that good enough?
That's perfect.
Okay. I opened this up not too long ago, and it got sent from, holy crap, I got sent from Minnesota to California. So I had it open a few weeks ago for John Woodland, who was sitting not too far away from me. So here's just the bottom of the can, and you can see that it's,
So keep it far away. Not right against it.
okay.
They're gonna yell. But yeah.
All right, so it must have been agitated in the shipping process. Usually the pigment separates on the bottom of the can, the binder is on top, and the camera can't smell this, but we can. It's pretty pungent, you know, and it's not too healthy for an individual. I don't know if you can get a shot of this or not, but you can kind of see that there's some swirling. If I keep mixing it, that color starts to get deeper and deeper. And when I get it stirred a little bit more, I'm going to just raise this up a little bit. I'll do it right-handed. You can kind of see it's pretty thick. Hence the need for a reducer to get it to flow through the cup. We should probably get some paper towels too, so we can not make a mess, you know what I mean? The more I stir it, the better it gets. And you can still kind of, this actually needs to be stirred for up to 5 minutes.
What would you like as far as a shot goes? Did that work for you?
Hey, camera speeds.
All right. Barry, how are the colors decided?
Somebody from Paisley Park or the Prince organization would come in with usually a piece of fabric and say, match this color. That's pretty much it.
Was it Prince's decision, or was there anybody else in his life that had a favorite color?
Well, this might be a better question for John, but what I've heard is that when it got turned from white to peach, Prince was dating a woman that loved the color peach.
John, is that satisfactory?
Oh, totally. That's awesome. Thank you.
Barry, tell us about the paint that you used to make this guitar yellow.
Okay.
What paint did you use?
House of Color by John Kosmosky. The best of the best. You can ask any major painter of hot rods or motorcycles, they're going to reach for House of Color. Really, it's just the best. And is it okay if I open this up now?
Tell us what kind of paint it is.
Well, it's an acrylic urethane. Acrylic urethane is different than acrylic lacquer because this is the base coat. This is a color coat. This gets applied first over that primed guitar. After the color coat dries, which was pretty fast, within an hour or two, then I can put on a coat of clear. And like I said before, acrylic urethane is more like painting an epoxy. There's the part A, there's a reducer that gets the paint to a point where it's going to go through a siphon gun. You know, it might be sprayed at 50 or 60 psi. A hardener would go in that too. So rather than the evaporation from lacquer thinner, you have a chemical reaction between that activator that goes in the clear. So within a couple hours, I could touch the paint. But I would let it hang overnight before it would come back. But acrylic urethane is pretty nasty stuff. I remember putting on a Tyvek suit, a hair sock over my face, nitrile gloves, and a respirator. And like I said, it's nasty shit.
Did the choice in paint have anything to do with the amount of time you were given to do these finishes?
Acrylic urethane is pretty much the same across the board. House of Color was picked because of the vibrancy of the yellow. It's just the Kosmosky paints were just so spectacular in color. And this guitar is, how old, John? 35 years at least, maybe 40?
It was finished in '85.
Yeah, so the colors, if you can see, are still pretty spectacular. They haven't yellowed at all, with lack of another term to use, but it's the color is true to form. The color out of this can of paint is exactly like this.
Let's pop that back on the stand and make sure that it's...
Camera speeds. Yep, I see it.
Would you just point at it so we can see?
Right through there is one area. And when you want to move to another area, let me know.
Yeah, and he can just go through what he just.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, let's just go through it. So
Okay.
start out by pointing at that. Yeah.
There's this area. There's that area that is on the fretboard right here. Right in between the 7th and 9th fret. Those are the three major areas, I thought.
Let's just go for the headstock then.
There's a touch-up right here on the scroll. There was a thin spot of paint right up here. On the back side, you can see that that tip has been broken off, and that would have been hard to repair or reshape to a point, so that was just left as is. And I don't know about the back. I think the back was mostly clean. You can see some cracking, which probably happened in its lifetime, which is 35 years old or more.
while we have it in your hands, could you flip it so the front of the body is exposed? Barry, what's this?
This right here, this area used to be all these guitars, the 4+1 guitars, were made from O'Hagan guitars. The size of the original O'Hagan guitars would have been cut off, and new longer pieces of wood would be grafted on in order to facilitate this type of a scroll. Now, the original O'Hagan guitars that these were built from had humbuckers in the neck position. This detent that you see right here, that humbucking hole was filled with a block of wood. After that block of wood was complete, a new pickup hole was routed for a single coil pickup. And instead of on that pickup, which is a humbucking, has an exterior ring mounted to the face of the guitar. Now with a single coil pickup on, like for example, a Stratocaster has a pick guard, and all the hardware and the electronics are mounted to that pick guard, and it gets bolted to the face of the guitar. In this case, no pick guard, but we have an access hole in the back, so we can load the pickup from the back and mount it this way with those two screws.
That's great. What's the last? So the last stuff we should talk about is probably the paint itself. And then we'll switch to Jerry. So
Okay.
Let's get that back on the stand.
Camera.
That is perfect. Barry, that is identical. I love seeing this.
And there's a point where you kind of lifted the stick up a little bit so you can kind of see it droop. There we go. Okay.
Yeah?
Okay.
Great. Great.
Okay, camera speeds.
All right. Barry and Jerry, are all of the cloud guitars identical?
No.
No, that they're all idiosyncratic and slightly different that I've seen. Again, my direct experience is with the first one, but the ones I've seen since, they all have little kind of differences and quirks.
They are not factory guitars in the sense that they were mass produced. They were produced one at a time, and every time they were done, there'd be slight differences.
What are some of those slight differences?
One of the big ones is that if you look into the control cavity, because of the way the bridge is set between this one and the first one, is there's an extra piece of wood glued right into the first one, so that there's space for this post to hit wood. That gets adjusted with this one. This is just moved slightly, and they move the back plate slightly, so you don't have to do that anymore. What are some of the other differences?
Well, one of the things that most Prince fans, Prince guitar fans do not know or understand is that their genealogy came from the O'Hagan Guitar Company. And John will probably explain a little bit more about that when it's his turn up here. But the way in which the original pickups were routed into the main body to where the posts were drilled for the bridge would be off slightly. And because of what Jerry had mentioned earlier about templates being utilized, sometimes these templates would get damaged, they'd have to be repaired. Every time they would be repaired and reused, there might be a minor difference in the shape of the pickup cavities or the cavity for the humbucker up here, for example. And then even the fretboards that were used. All the parts that were utilized for the Prince guitars came from older, leftover parts from the O'Hagan Guitar Company. And we had bins of truss rods, we had bins of fretboards, we had complete guitars that had not been lacquered in a bin. And whenever a Prince guitar needed to be constructed, I'd just grab a guitar, cut off the sides, put on a fretboard, and et cetera, et cetera. A lot of times the fretboards were not installed, sometimes they were.
You're also going to see a lot of variation when it comes to things that aren't either pre-made, manufactured, right, or done with templates, where the luthiers had to kind of make it up, right, and figure out things like the angle of the horn, or where these contours are. And so if you held all of them next to each other, you'd see different variations that all have to do with the kind of idiosyncratic decisions that were made at the time, because as Barry said, they're kind of one-offs, even though the basic backbone of all of them is an O'Hagan guitar. From that point on, there are going to be some variations.
And I want to add a little bit going before these cloud guitars. There is a guitar builder from New York City, Jeff Levin, who designed and built the first model that would have been used to make the guitars. He made a sardonyx bass guitar. It's basically the same thing. The scale length was 34 inches. The scale length on this is 24.65. So this guitar was shrunk down to get a guitar, because that's what Prince wanted. He had the sardonyx bass. John can go into the history on that. But one of the major things that was involved with, can I pick this up, was this horn right here. When you put this on, and most guitar players, when they want to position their fingers or their hands, are looking down at the side markers right down here. They're not flipping the guitar and looking at the face of the guitar, although some do. They're dialing in their hand position, looking at the edge. Well, on that original sardonyx bass guitar and the first two cloud guitars that were done, this horn right here was beveled back to in the fact that the player could look down at the sides. This guitar is number 3, and the person at the time didn't take this into account and left this parallel with this surface right here. The original 2 and the sardonyx were kicked back a little bit to allow the player to see the sides.
Hold real quick. Can we get, so what he's talking about is,
Asking Barry the ratio for reducer and main.
Oh, don't ask me that because I forget.
I thought you said it was